I didn't react when they replaced me. I sat there, nodded, even thanked them, because the shock was too heavy to break through, and somewhere between the polite smiles and the sliding of that severance envelope across the table, I felt something inside me fold quietly, like a structure collapsing without noise. 12 years didn't flash before my eyes. They simply vanished, erased with administrative efficiency. And what hurt most wasn't losing the job, it was realizing they had already decided my absence wouldn't matter. I watched them speak about fresh direction while I calculated how many late nights, how many saved contracts, how many invisible fixes were now reduced to a bullet point in someone else's presentation. My hands stayed still, my voice stayed calm, but inside, a slow, cold anger began replacing the numbness. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. I noticed who avoided eye contact, who seemed relieved, who was already discussing my responsibilities as if I were no longer in the room. That's when the humiliation deepened, because it wasn't just the loss of position, it was the theft of identity, the quiet rewriting of history. They believed I would walk out, disappear, and rebuild somewhere else. They assumed I would move on. But as I left the building, badge deactivated behind me, I realized I wasn't grieving the past, I was studying the future. Every weakness, every dependency, every undocumented system they now owned without understanding. I wasn't thinking about revenge emotionally. I was mapping it patiently, like an engineer measuring load points before a controlled demolition. By the time I reached the parking lot, the numbness had hardened into something colder than anger. That was the moment I stopped trying to recover and started preparing to erase them. Have you ever smiled while your entire life was quietly being taken away from you? I did. I remember the fluorescent lights above the conference table, too bright, too clinical, making everything look unreal. Harrison Cole was speaking, but his words sounded distant, like they were traveling through water. Fresh direction, modernization, leadership transition. I watched his lips move, and I nodded slightly, as if I understood, as if I agreed. Inside, something fragile cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a silent fracture spreading through everything I thought was stable. Ethan Clark sat beside him, younger, confident, scanning documents that used to belong to me. My documents, my workflows, my language rewritten in his tone. I noticed the way Lucas Reed kept his eyes on the table. Marcus Hill shifted in his chair. Olivia Bennett typed something on her phone, pretending this was routine. Nobody looked surprised. That was the first cut, the realization that this wasn't sudden, this wasn't rushed, this had been discussed, approved, prepared. I was the only one hearing it for the first time. I kept my posture straight, my hands rested calmly on the table. I even asked one polite question about transition timelines. My voice sounded steady, controlled, professional, but inside, my thoughts moved slowly, like thick fog. 12 years, late nights, crisis calls, weekends sacrificed. None of it felt real anymore. It felt like I was remembering someone else's career. I studied the printed org chart they slid toward me. My name had been moved, not removed, moved downward. A symbolic gesture, soft humiliation, reclassification disguised as opportunity. I nodded again. Harrison smiled, relieved by my composure. He expected resistance, emotion, maybe even anger. I gave him none of it. That seemed to comfort him. He relaxed back in his chair, already talking about knowledge transfer. That phrase echoed, knowledge transfer, as if everything I built could simply be handed over in a few meetings, as if expertise lived in documents, as if memory could be exported. When the meeting ended, nobody rushed to speak to me. That silence followed me into the hallway. My footsteps sounded louder than usual. I passed my own team. They smiled carefully, too carefully, like people at a funeral who aren't sure what to say. I opened my office door and looked around. The chair, the whiteboard, the pinned notes,
all suddenly temporary. I sat down slowly, and for the first time I realized something didn't make sense. They hadn't asked what I knew. They hadn't asked what depended on me. They hadn't asked anything at all. And that's when I understood. This betrayal wasn't careless. It was confident.
I replayed the meeting in my head for hours. Not the words, but the pauses, the glances, the things nobody said. I remembered how Ethan Clark already had login credentials printed in his folder, not temporary ones, full access. That meant approvals had been signed days earlier. I remembered how Harrison never once asked for my input, only my cooperation. I remembered Lucas Reed avoiding me not out of sympathy, but guilt. And then I noticed the detail that tightened something in my chest. My quarterly strategy document, the one I submitted privately to leadership, was already summarized in Ethan's presentation slides. My ideas, my projections, presented as part of the new direction. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask. I simply watched. That silence felt heavier than anger. I packed slowly, deliberately leaving certain notebooks in my drawer, not by accident, by design. Olivia stopped by and said, "I'm sure this will open new doors." I smiled politely. I didn't tell her the door had already been closed from the other side. When my badge stopped working on Friday, security apologized awkwardly. I told them it was fine. It wasn't, but I kept my voice calm. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because it didn't. My role wasn't just taken, it was rewritten. Emails started circulating with Ethan's name attached to initiatives I had launched. Clients were told leadership had evolved. My identity inside the company dissolved faster than I expected. It felt like watching someone else erase me in real time. I realized I hadn't just lost a job, I had lost authorship of 12 years. That night, I opened my laptop at home and reviewed archived system logs, quietly, methodically, not out of anger, out of curiosity. I traced dependencies, ownership permissions, automation triggers. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. They didn't understand what they had taken, and more importantly, they didn't understand what they had just broken. That's when the final realization settled in. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was planned, and they had no idea what they had just set in motion. Have you ever stayed completely silent, not because you were defeated, but because you were measuring everything? I did. The week after I left, I didn't call anyone, didn't post anything, didn't announce my next move. I simply watched. LinkedIn updates, internal rumors passed quietly through former colleagues, small signals. Harrison Cole posted about exciting transformation. Ethan Clark shared a photo from the conference room I used to lead meetings in. They looked relaxed, confident, victorious. That confidence told me more than any document ever could. I noticed how quickly they began celebrating. Marcus Hill mentioned a smooth transition in a client call summary that someone forwarded to me. Smooth. That word lingered. They truly believed nothing critical depended on me. They assumed systems would keep running because they always had. They assumed stability was automatic. I didn't correct them. Silence became my advantage. Invisible, unthreatening, forgotten. From the outside, I appeared to be rebuilding quietly. I updated my resume, I scheduled a few casual conversations, but most of my time wasn't spent moving forward, it was spent observing backward. I mapped the dependencies I had designed, automated reports triggered by conditions nobody else knew existed, client dashboards connected to fragile data sources, fail-safes that required manual adjustments every quarter. They weren't obvious flaws, they were quiet vulnerabilities, and they were now in the hands of people who didn't know they existed.
I watched Harrison relax in interviews, talking about efficiency gains. I watched Ethan speak confidently about scaling operations. They weren't cautious, they weren't verifying, they were accelerating. That's when I saw it, the weakness. Their confidence relied on continuity. They assumed the machine would keep working because it always had, but the machine wasn't automatic. It was maintained, quietly, constantly, by me. I didn't interfere, not yet. I just waited. Days passed. Then I saw the first sign. A client report delayed by 12 hours. Small, easy to dismiss. Then another, a formatting inconsistency in a dashboard. Minor, but I knew what it meant. The system wasn't broken. It was drifting, slowly, subtly. They wouldn't panic yet. They'd assume it was temporary. That's when I realized something important. I didn't need to attack. I only needed to stop protecting them.
The first move didn't look like revenge. It looked like coincidence. I accepted a consulting call with a former client, casually, unofficially, just a conversation. They mentioned confusion about reporting delays. I listened quietly. I didn't criticize my old company. I simply offered clarity. I explained industry benchmarks, suggested alternative data validation methods, and outlined how oversight gaps could create long-term risks. I never named anyone, I never blamed anyone, but the message landed. 2 days later, that client requested additional verification from Harrison's team. Nothing dramatic, just questions, more scrutiny, more pressure. Ethan Clark responded confidently, but I could almost hear the uncertainty in the phrasing. They didn't know why the system was behaving differently. They assumed it was volume, temporary load. They still didn't see the pattern. Meanwhile, I quietly joined Westbridge Analytics. No announcement, no celebration, just access, tools, infrastructure, and patience. William Harper gave me space. He didn't ask what I planned. He just said, "Take your time." That trust felt different, not loud, not performative. It gave me room to move carefully. Another small shift happened. A secondary client reached out for benchmarking advice. Again, I stayed neutral, calm, informative. I highlighted risks of rapid restructuring without knowledge continuity. The phrase circulated, knowledge continuity. It sounded harmless, but inside my former company, it triggered discomfort. Meetings increased. Ethan began asking for documentation that didn't exist. Harrison reassured leadership everything was under control, but the tone had changed. The mini-revenge wasn't about damage, it was about doubt. Quiet doubt, the kind that spreads slowly and forces people to question their own certainty. I didn't push further, I let them sit with it. I let them assume the issues were random. That made it more effective. One evening, I reviewed the latest industry chatter and saw something subtle. Harrison had postponed a client expansion announcement. Not canceled, postponed. That hesitation told me everything. They felt instability, but couldn't explain it. They were starting to look over their shoulders without knowing why. I leaned back, closed my laptop, and allowed myself one small breath. Not satisfaction, not victory, just confirmation. They thought my silence meant I had moved on. They thought the transition was complete. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started.
Have you ever watched small problems grow, knowing they would eventually suffocate someone else? I did. The ripple from those girly doubts began spreading quietly. Reports weren't just late anymore, they were inconsistent. One dashboard contradicted another. Clients started asking follow-up questions instead of accepting summaries. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the rhythm had changed. Harrison's team moved faster, but the faster they moved, the more visible the cracks became. I stayed silent and observed. I noticed the tone shift in their communications. Emails that once sounded confident now carried defensive explanations. Ethan Clark began copying more people on updates. Marcus Hill requested additional clarifications before client calls. These weren't failures, they were symptoms. And symptoms create paranoia. I could almost feel it building inside their office, the quiet suspicion that something was wrong, but nobody knew what. They couldn't accuse anyone. They couldn't identify the cause. That uncertainty was heavier than a direct threat. At the same time, something inside me changed too. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was becoming methodical, colder. I noticed how easy it was to detach emotionally when everything became strategic. Revenge stopped feeling like anger. It started feeling like structure, like engineering. I measured timelines, quarter-end deadlines, contract renewals. A major expansion deal Harrison had been promoting publicly was scheduled to close within weeks. That deal relied on clean reporting metrics now slowly destabilizing. The pressure wasn't explosive, it was tightening, like a rope gradually pulled. They rushed to correct minor issues, but each correction created new inconsistencies. Ethan began requesting historical context he didn't have. Harrison reassured leadership again, but reassurance without certainty sounded hollow. I could sense the tension rising. Then I noticed something else. They scheduled an internal audit, quietly. No announcement, just a review meeting placed on calendars. That meant they suspected structural problems. That meant they were searching, but they were searching in the wrong direction. The deadline for that expansion deal moved closer, and I realized the pressure wasn't just building for them. It was reaching the point where one mistake could trigger everything.
How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? I asked myself that question as the situation tightened, because by now I wasn't just observing, I was influencing outcomes simply by existing in the background. Clients began cross-checking information more often. Leadership at my former company grew cautious. Meetings multiplied. Harrison's tone shifted from confident to urgent. The environment inside that office, once relaxed, now felt defensive. They were trying to solve a puzzle without knowing someone had removed a few key pieces. I kept my behavior neutral, professional, even supportive when speaking to shared contacts. That harmlessness became my shield. No one suspected me because I never attacked. I only answered questions. But each answer increased scrutiny on them, quietly, gradually, like fog thickening around a moving vehicle. The expansion deal reached its final stage. I knew the numbers they were presenting depended on automation scripts that required manual quarterly recalibration, something no one else knew. The recalibration date had already passed. That meant the projections would drift further with every day. They would look accurate on the surface, but collapse under deeper inspection. I didn't touch anything. I didn't interfere. I simply watched time do the work. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened inside me. A flicker of doubt. Not guilt, something heavier. I realized the consequences might be bigger than I originally imagined. Careers, reputations, entire teams affected. Revenge wasn't abstract anymore. It had weight. But I didn't stop. I couldn't, because the moment had already begun moving forward. Then I gained access to something that changed everything. A former colleague quietly shared the pre-audit documentation draft. Not intentionally, just a casual, "What do you think?" message. I scanned it slowly. My heartbeat didn't change, but my mind sharpened. The audit focused on operational efficiency, not data integrity. They were investigating the wrong area entirely. That meant the real fault line remained hidden, and I now knew exactly when it would break.
Have you ever watched chaos surface while pretending nothing had changed? That's exactly where I found myself. The first visible crack appeared during a client review call. I wasn't on the call, but I heard about it within hours. The numbers didn't align. Not dramatically, just enough to raise eyebrows. Harrison reassured them it was a formatting issue. Ethan promised corrected files, but the correction didn't fully match the original dataset. That inconsistency spread quietly through internal channels. What used to be dismissed as minor glitches now felt like a pattern. I stayed calm. Outwardly, my days looked ordinary. I attended meetings at Westbridge, I reviewed proposals, I spoke carefully, never referencing my former company. But internally, I tracked every ripple. I noticed Harrison began delaying public announcements. I noticed leadership requesting additional validation before presentations. The confidence that once filled their messaging had thinned. They were still functioning, but cautiously, and caution slows everything. The expansion deal reached the final presentation stage. That was when the pressure became visible. Their team worked late, revising projections repeatedly. Ethan Clark started asking for historical baselines he couldn't fully verify. Marcus Hill pushed for reassurance before speaking to the client. No one panicked publicly, but the urgency was obvious. They were trying to stabilize something they didn't fully understand. Then the client asked for a deeper breakdown, a routine request, but it required exposing the underlying calculations. That's when the inconsistencies surfaced clearly. Harrison called for an emergency internal review. Emails became shorter, meetings became closed doors. People started whispering again, this time not about me, about risk. And then something shifted. Harrison Cole mentioned my name for the first time since I left, not publicly, quietly. Someone told him he built most of the structure. That single sentence changed the direction of suspicion, not accusation, just awareness. Harrison didn't contact me, he didn't ask questions, but he started looking backward. That was the moment I knew the revenge had become visible, and visibility always leads to confrontation.
The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Harrison didn't call me directly. He reached out through a neutral industry contact, casually asking about my availability for consulting insights. The tone was polite, almost friendly, but I recognized the shift immediately. He wasn't asking for help, he was probing for answers. I agreed to a short call, calmly, professionally. When we spoke, he avoided the real issue at first, small talk, market trends, operational scaling. Then he asked about knowledge gaps during transitions. I answered carefully, general advice, nothing specific. I never mentioned their systems, I never hinted at weaknesses, but I could hear tension in his pauses. He wanted certainty. I gave him ambiguity. That frustrated him more than silence. He eventually asked, "Do you think rapid restructuring can create instability?" I replied, "Only if continuity isn't understood." That was it. No accusation, no threat, just a statement. The line stayed with him, I could tell. He ended the call politely, but the conversation had already shifted the balance. He now suspected the problem existed before he understood it. What he didn't know was that the trap had been set long before that call. Not intentionally at first, just the natural design of complex systems. Dependencies layered over time, manual recalibrations, quiet safeguards. Once I left, those safeguards began expiring. The timeline wasn't random, it was inevitable. The expansion deal deadline aligned perfectly with the first major recalibration lapse. By the time Harrison realized it, they were already presenting unstable projections. He tried to accelerate fixes, emergency adjustments, late-night revisions, but every correction exposed new inconsistencies. The deeper they dug, the more fragile everything appeared. Leadership demanded answers. The client delayed their decision. The audit team expanded their scope. Momentum reversed.
I didn't push, I didn't interfere, I simply watched inevitability unfold. Because the most dangerous part of the trap wasn't the moment it triggered, it was the fact that it couldn't be undone. Even if they corrected everything now, the doubt had already spread. Trust once questioned doesn't return quickly. And by the time Harrison realized how long this had been building, the damage had already happened.
Have you ever reached the point where winning and losing start to look the same? That's where I was when everything tightened at once. The expansion deal stalled, not canceled, stalled. The client requested a full independent verification. Leadership inside my former company demanded explanations. The internal audit expanded beyond efficiency and moved toward structural reliability. What had started as quiet doubt was now open pressure, and pressure spreads fast. I watched from a distance, but distance didn't mean detachment anymore. Former colleagues started messaging me indirectly, asking neutral questions that weren't really neutral. How did you handle quarterly recalibration? Did we ever document fallback procedures? Their tone wasn't accusatory, it was searching, desperate. That's when the weight of what I had set in motion became real. Not just for Harrison, not just for Ethan. Entire teams were now exposed to uncertainty. For the first time, I considered stepping back. Not reversing anything, that wasn't possible, but refusing to push further. I told myself I had already made my point. My dignity had been restored quietly. I had moved on professionally. Maybe that was enough. I closed my laptop one evening and sat in silence, staring at nothing. The anger that once fueled me had cooled. What remained was something heavier: responsibility. At the same time, the risk grew for me as well. If they connected enough pieces, they might suspect I understood more than I admitted. Not sabotage, but influence. Reputation mattered. I had built credibility on calm professionalism. If I appeared vindictive, everything I gained could fracture. Revenge always carries a cost. I was beginning to feel it. The audit team requested historical data ownership logs. That meant they were tracing system evolution. If they followed the timeline, my name would appear repeatedly, not as blame, but as origin. That visibility made me uncomfortable. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The situation had grown beyond a personal score. It had become structural collapse. And then the client set a final deadline for decision. Everything balanced on that moment. I realized I wasn't just watching anymore. I was standing on the edge of something that could still consume me too.
The night before the deadline, I almost walked away completely. I told myself silence had done enough. I even drafted a neutral advisory note I considered sending anonymously, something that might stabilize the situation. I didn't send it. I sat with it instead, feeling the unfamiliar pull of hesitation. Revenge had changed me more than I expected. I was calmer, sharper, but also colder. And I wondered if finishing this meant crossing a line I couldn't return from. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? The answer came unexpectedly. Early the next morning, I received a message from Marcus Hill. Short, careful. He wrote, "They're blaming transition gaps. Leadership thinks nothing critical depended on one person." I read that sentence twice. Nothing critical depended on one person. The same assumption, the same dismissal. Even now, they still didn't understand. They weren't learning. They were protecting their narrative. That message removed my hesitation. I didn't need to act directly. The reversal happened through timing. The client's independent verification exposed projection inconsistencies tied to outdated recalibration logic. Not catastrophic, but enough to trigger contract hesitation. The deal didn't collapse instantly. It paused publicly. That pause sent a signal across the industry. Confidence dropped. Questions multiplied.
Harrison's team scrambled to explain. Ethan defended methodology. Leadership demanded accountability. Then came the moment of realization. Harrison reviewed historical ownership and saw the pattern. Every critical dependency traced back to me. Not sabotage, not interference, just absence. The structure had relied on knowledge he had dismissed. That's when he understood someone wasn't attacking him. They were simply no longer protecting him. And for the first time, he knew exactly who had been quietly dismantling the illusion.
Have you ever seen something collapse slowly and realized no one could stop it anymore? That's how it unfolded. The expansion deal didn't just pause, it fractured confidence. The client requested additional safeguards, then delayed their commitment indefinitely. That delay triggered internal consequences. Forecasts were revised, leadership meetings multiplied. Harrison's authority weakened, not dramatically, but noticeably. Decisions that once passed quickly now faced scrutiny. Every number required validation. Every claim needed proof. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing loud about this moment. My days continued normally. I reviewed proposals. I led small strategy calls. Outwardly, my life had moved on. But quietly, I watched the final phase begin. The audit team widened their scope, now focusing on continuity planning. That single shift exposed how dependent operations had been on undocumented knowledge. Ethan Clark struggled to reconstruct processes he had inherited but never fully understood. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. The system hadn't failed, it had been abandoned. Industry chatter began reflecting uncertainty. Not rumors, just hesitation. Competitors sensed instability. Clients started requesting dual verification. Harrison attempted to regain control, scheduling new presentations, promising improved oversight. But momentum had changed direction. Trust doesn't collapse loudly, it erodes, slowly, irreversibly. One by one, smaller accounts paused expansions. Nothing dramatic, just caution. That caution spread internally. Marcus Hill stopped promising aggressive timelines. Olivia Bennett softened marketing language. The organization that once projected certainty now projected carefulness. That difference was subtle but powerful. Meanwhile, Westbridge gained quiet opportunities. Not because I targeted anyone, but because reliability attracts movement. Clients seeking stability gravitated naturally. I handled each transition calmly, professionally, without referencing the past. No gloating, no explanation, just execution. Harrison finally stepped back from leading operational strategy. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, it was loss of confidence. Ethan remained, but his authority narrowed. Leadership redistributed responsibilities. The power structure changed. And I realized something important. The revenge was no longer something I was doing. It had become something that was simply happening.
When everything settled, the silence felt heavier than any victory. I sat one evening reviewing the past year, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. I had lost more than a job that day in the conference room. I had lost identity, authorship, and the quiet respect built over 12 years. My work had been reassigned, my history rewritten, my presence erased. That loss couldn't be undone. But something else had returned. Control. Not over them, but over myself. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't threatened, I hadn't exposed anything dramatically. I had simply stepped away and allowed reality to surface. That was the part that stayed with me. They underestimated silence. They mistook calmness for weakness. They assumed the absence of resistance meant the absence of consequence. But consequence doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives through patience.
I reclaimed dignity not by proving them wrong directly, but by refusing to correct their assumptions. The truth emerged on its own timeline. Harrison lost authority. Ethan lost certainty. The company lost momentum. Not destroyed, just changed. And I moved forward, not as someone seeking revenge anymore, but as someone who understood the power of restraint. Looking back, I realized revenge hadn't restored the past, it had clarified it. I wasn't valuable because of a title. I was valuable because of knowledge, discipline, and patience. Once those were removed, the structure weakened naturally. That lesson mattered more than any outcome. People often expect revenge to be loud, emotional, explosive. Mine wasn't. Mine was quiet, controlled, almost invisible, and that made it irreversible, because by the time anyone understood what had happened, nothing could be rolled back. I closed my laptop, leaned back, and allowed the silence to settle. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.